Hi, welcome to another episode of About the Authors TV. I'm your host, Jake Brown. Medical thrillers are among the most challenging to write in the world of fiction, and tonight we have one of the true pioneers, Dr. Tess Gerritsen, joining us. Whether you're a fan of Harvest or Bloodstream or the Rosoli and Isles series, you'll hear about it all tonight. Tess, we're so happy to have you on the show. Thanks for being with us. It's always wonderful when an author on the show takes us back to childhood and into some of the books that first captured their imagination and got them excited about reading. What were a few of the titles that really first got you interested?
My mom was an immigrant from China, so she had a little trouble reading full-length books. So she had a whole collection of Reader's Digest condensed books. And that's how I got into reading adult novels. But I started off reading, Nancy Drew, all the things that young girls would read. We had a local library I could walk to. So I feel like I grew up with a really rich library, whether it's my own or it was, down the street. I've always been interested in mysteries, so that was the Nancy Drew side, but I also loved Tolkien. I loved, everything to do with Sherlock Holmes. I started reading Gothic novels when I was a teenage girl and, first getting interested in boys. So I feel that, I had this, as you said, a diet that just spanned all kind of genres, and including science fiction. Isaac Asimov was a big favorite of mine. So just bringing in all those interests and all those books from my childhood, I think it made it easy for me to feel like I could write anything.
You're such a natural storyteller. I bet that began as a child too.
We used to drive. I lived in California growing up, so we had long, long drives with my parents. We'd go to Los Angeles and drive from San Diego to LA and San Francisco. I was never bored. I was never the kid saying, "Are we there yet?" Because I was busy making up stories in the back seat. I think there's having a really rich imaginary life helped. But my very first book that I put, from pen to paper, was at age 7. And, I think that's really a universal age for a lot of writers. I talk to them and they say, yeah, I wrote my first book when I was 7, or I knew I was going to be a writer when I was 7.
The magic age. That's still quite young and impressive. What was that first book called?
Um, I'm trying to remember what it was called. It was about my dead cat. It was sort of a memorial to my cat and how it had lived and how much I loved it. So, not really that impressive.
True, but it sounds like the spark that lit the fire for you to keep writing stories.
Yes, I did. I continued to write. And I was writing even through medical school, and, those long hours as a medical intern, working 80, 100 hours a week, I would still carve out time to write something.
It's interesting you bring up that backdrop of how your medical and then writing careers intersected. It sounds like they began at the same time, working at night shift at the hospital?
Well, no, if you were on call at the hospital, you had a sleep room. There was like an intern call room. So it had a bed, it had a desk, and that's, if I couldn't sleep or I had a free moment, I would be there.
For viewers who know your books but might not know the full extent of your medical background, you have a BA from Stanford and then an MD from University of California, San Francisco. What first inspired you to want to enter medical school and become a physician?
I went into medicine partly because I come from a very conservative Chinese American family that doesn't believe the arts is a way to make a living. And my dad, I told him when I was a teenager that I wanted to be a writer, and he said, yeah, but how are you going to feed yourself? So in a way, medicine was the fallback position. It's, in case you can't make it in this writing gig, you can always go back to being a doctor. That was the way it was said. So that's partly the reason I went to medical school. I mean, I love science, and I really enjoyed the biology part of it. But I knew from the beginning that I was a writer, and I always knew I was going to be doing that, whether as an avocation or as a profession someday. I worked as a I guess a 3/4 time doctor for about 7 or 8 years, but at the same time I was also a mom then, so I had like 2 little boys. Plus I was trying to write on the side, so it was a crazy time in my life.
It sounds like that's really where your heart was already set on. When do you remember first sitting down to work for Harlequin on the romance novels that became your first books, like Call After Midnight?
At the time I wrote Call After Midnight, I was reading a lot of romantic suspense. I mean, I love romance novels. And I'm very proud of those romance novels, even though my mystery readers will sometimes go, what, you wrote romance? So I was reading a lot, and so it was natural to write in the genre that I love. But I also have to admit that they were never pure romance, that the mystery was always at least 50% of those stories. So early on I knew I probably should have been a mystery writer to begin with. But no, it was just a matter of writing the story I wanted to write.
Whether it's Under the Knife, Ready to Die, Peggy Sue Got Murdered, or Whistleblower, you wrote prolifically back in those early days. Any favorites among those early books?
I mean, they're all my babies, but I mean, there are a couple that stand out where I just feel like I finished that book and I thought, wow, I really enjoyed that. I mean, my very first, the published one, Call After Midnight, I still love that novel. Partly because it was my first published book, but also because it had all this international spy intrigue, and that was fun for me. Process, that's what I learned, because I had a horrible second book syndrome, where I wrote Call After Midnight. It was nominated for Rita Award. It did really well for Harlequin, and then I think there were 2 or 3 years between that and the next book because I was having such a hard time getting that second book written. Your first book is always the one that we have all the time in the world. We can spend years writing our first book. We don't have to feel that we're under deadline. So that one was easy to write. But when you all of a sudden have an editor saying, well, when is the next book coming? That pressure can really, really gum up the gears. So I had a hard time with that second book, and I learned after that, and this was where writing for romance novels, the romance genre, and having to write books quickly was really helpful to me. I learned not to freak out so much. I learned that I should accept a really bad first draft. I learned that it's most important to get the words down on the page and not worry about whether they were perfect or not, and just get going, just tell the story, and then you can go back and fix things. So that's really the process that I absorbed then, is you can always go back and fix things.
That's great advice for viewers who might aspire to become novelists in terms of learning the craft early on.
Yeah, I mean, I think Nora Roberts has this wonderful quote. She said, I can fix a bad page, but I can't fix a blank page. So just get those words down.
Let's talk about that proverbial moment when the switch went off and your niche as a specialty author of medical thrillers began with Harvest. Tell us why that felt right at that time to make that transition.
It was a conversation. So I've been writing, I wrote 9 romance novels, and none of them really had powerful medical themes. I mean, there may have been a little bit. But I had a conversation with a cop who had been traveling to Russia, and he said that children were disappearing from the streets of Moscow, and the Russian cops thought they were being shipped off to be organ donors. They were, killed and have their organs removed. And he thought that was true. The cops in Russia certainly were working on that idea. And I thought, oh my God, this is a book. This really is a novel. But it's not a romance novel. You can hear that and think, no, Harlequin's never going to take that one. So I just thought this is going to be a switch for me, because I finally get to use my medicine. And that book had a lot of medicine in it. I mean, just from the point of view of what it's like to be a surgical resident, to the autopsy room. And I knew that it was going to have to go to a different publisher. And right about that time, I got a new agent, a literary agent. My previous agent did not know I was a medical doctor. I never told her, because I thought it was irrelevant to what I was doing in romance. And I remember pitching it to her, and she said, well, that's a great idea, but you can't really sell a medical thriller unless you're a doctor. And I said, there's something I haven't told you. And then I told her I was a medical doctor, and she said, why the hell haven't you been writing medical thrillers? So then about that time I was changing agents, and it just happened. I mean, I wrote the book very, very quickly. It went to kind of almost an auction until there was a preemptive bid, and Harvest got a fantastic launch from Simon & Schuster.
You'd held other finished published books in your hand before. Was this special in any unique way, being a medical thriller, because it was this kind of turn in career direction for you?
I think the fun part was that it felt weighty. It felt heavy. It was the longest book I've been able to write, so it was way longer. And it felt like I don't want to say that there are real books and not real books, but to me it felt like I finally wrote a real book, because it was my first hardcover too.
When you turn to books like Bloodstream, Gravity, Life Support, and The Bone Garden, you really found that sweet spot between the thriller and the medical aspects of writing. Tell us about that.
I think it's really important to remember that the science is not the important part. The medicine is not the important part. It's finding that emotional kind of key to get into the story. For instance, let's talk about the book Bloodstream. that is a medical thriller. Okay, it's just actually about this horrible brain parasite. But that is not the story. The story is about a mother struggling with her teenage son in a little town in the wintertime in an isolated place in Maine where all the kids suddenly become violent. And yeah, the answer is medical, and there's a lot of medical stuff in there, but really it gets right down to this mother and her son, and how are they going to heal their relationship because the father's dead. So you find the emotional key to the story first. But Gravity. Okay, Gravity was about a disease that goes amok on the International Space Station. Okay, medical stuff, lots of sci-fi stuff, lots of astro stuff. But it was really about a husband and wife who are separated. One is in space and one is on Earth. One of them is dying. What would you do to save your dying spouse? So that was really the way I approached that story. I should backtrack and say, where did that idea come from for Gravity? Yeah, there was some stuff about, there's some medical and biological stuff that was interesting to me that kind of served the background. But the real emotional core happened because I had read that book, Into Thin Air by John Krakauer. Now, this is about mountain climbers. I mean, what does that have to do with this? What got to me, and it still makes me choked up, is that those mountain climbers got up. A storm came in. They knew they were going to die. And one of them took out a satellite telephone to call his wife to say goodbye. And I thought, what is that last conversation like? You know your spouse is there. You can't save him. He's dying, and there's nothing you can do about it. That became Gravity.
I can tell that In Their Footsteps and Thief of Hearts from the Travistock series still really puts a smile on your face years later. What did you most enjoy about writing it?
I think it was Cary Grant. It was, those old movies with those fun, probably an Alfred Hitchcock, Cary Grant kind of a story, where they're light, they're mystery, they're some kind of and they're rich people. I think that was more of it was a caper similar to what I imagined Downton Abbey would be like if one of them was actually a spy. So that was the idea. I wanted to do something light and fun.
With The Surgeon and then The Apprentice, respectively, please tell us when Boston homicide detective Jane Rosoli and then chief medical examiner Dr. Maura Isles first walked into your imagination.
I didn't write Rosoli and Isles, the first Rosoli and Isles book, until 2001. Jane came first. Jane came in a book called The Surgeon, and she was not even the major character there. She was a minor character. Because it was about it was sort of a medical thriller, serial killer combination. And Jane was one of the detectives who was working the case of this serial killer. And I thought she was going to die. I just thought, oh, you're a throwaway character. I don't need to make you likable. You just come in and do your thing and be a bitch. And then when you die, we won't feel bad. But as the story went on, I was, this is the thing about secondary characters. They develop without you thinking about them. They happen on their own. So you're not thinking too hard about them. And they acquire these characteristics that feel very organic because they happened on their own. So as I was writing the story, I realized that Jane was really interesting. She's the only female cop in this 12-person homicide unit, which was really realistic for Boston PD at the time. People didn't like her. She always has this chip on her shoulder for good reason, because they were ignoring her. She grew up with brothers, so she's used to kind of fighting back. And by the time I got to the scene where I was going to kill her, and if you read the story, you'll know where that scene is, I couldn't do it. I just thought, I like you too much. I respect you. I may not like you as a person. I may not want to hang out with you, but I respect you. So she survived. And I finished the book, and my agent said, well, what's next? And I said, well, I'm really kind of curious about Jane. What happens to her next? So that's how the second book came about, which was The Apprentice. It was because I wanted to find out, does Jane Rosoli ever fall in love? Does she ever get happy? And that's when Maura Isles came in as a secondary character. Again, not somebody I thought was going to be continuing. And in fact, when she walked in, she was a big mystery to me. I didn't understand her. She had this shield. I just knew that she was very, very cool, very intellectual, and very standoffish. So by the end of that story, I wanted to delve into her. I thought, well, who is the real Maura Isles? And that's how the series began.
Why did you feel Boston was the perfect city to base the show in?
Okay, so I live in Maine, and we don't have enough murders here to set a serial killer series in Maine. We just don't. So Boston is the nearest town to me, and I decided to use Boston because it was easy enough for me to drive down there and do research if I needed to.
I imagine, like so many peers we've talked to on the show that do series, when Jane and Maura started to come to life in your mind on the page, they had their own personalities, they had their own voices, and so forth.
Yeah, I mean their voices are very distinct. Jane is I mean she's like a lot of female cops I know. She's very aggressive. She's very to the point. She's not going to mince words. And Maura is really like me. I don't. I'm a very shy, almost antisocial person. For me, intellect, logic is it's a comfort blanket, and so that's Maura. So when you hear them talking, Maura's going to be talking about you know patterns of cerebral fractures, and Jane's going to be talking about something else. So when I hear them talk, I can hear their voices. Yeah, I think that's really common for writers to hear their characters' voices.
Any advice you'd share from your own experience writing these two lead female protagonists on character development in general?
I never do character studies ahead of time. I never do character bios. I find that those are just there's that's as interesting as reading like a college application. They're just not very. They're not a lot of fun. So my idea is that a good character, is like a real person. They're people that you don't know anything about except for their sex, their age, their race, and maybe you know their profession. So it's like meeting somebody for the first time. And in the course of the year that it takes to write the story, that's how you figure them out because they start to say things, they start to do things, and they define themselves. I never feel, like I need to know everything about a character when I start because I know it will eventually show up somewhere on the page. Now that may change. I mean, there may be a lot of morphs. There may be a lot of changing of that person as you're writing. I've actually had a character go from a man to a woman halfway through the book. So yeah, they can even do sex changes. But you feel your way through it. And in a way, it's telling you that my first drafts are really crap. They're just because I don't know what's going on until I finish the first draft. I know there are writers to do that, but I can't. Every time I've tried to follow a detailed outline, it always falls apart. Never works. I have an idea of where it's going, but very often it's like not till 2/3 of the way through the book that I know who the killer is.
Wow, fascinating. Over books that follow, like The Sinner, Body Double, and Vanish, we meet some creepy antagonists. Do they first have to scare you on the page before you know they're going to scare readers?
Well, first of all, everybody thinks I write bloody books, but I really don't because you almost never see the violence on the page. The blood comes in the operating room or the autopsy room where people are just doing their jobs, and that's realistic. You have to see blood there. My I think the antagonist is really the hardest person to write because you have to be able to understand why they're doing these horrific things. And if you yourself are not, inclined to kill people, that's a leap that you have to make. So for Warren Hoyt, who was the villain in The Surgeon, I had to get into his head, and that was really kind of a creepy place to be. I began to try and see the world through his eyes. Just imagine what does a lion see when he looks over at the savannah? He sees prey. So how do you go about your day-to-day life as the lion, as the hunter? You walk through a mall, you look at people and you think, which ones would I kill? Which ones are vulnerable? Which ones could I actually take down? So that's I think what you really have to do is get in their heads. It's not a comfortable place to be, but once you really have that connection with the killer, it's easy to write their point of view. Well, the villain body double is kind of, I don't want to mention that person's name. I mean, the real villain and body double. Yeah, that's one of those cases where there were several endings and you only found the killer at the last ending. I think that what I found with body double was that there is a hidden killer, but then there are also the killers that come out earlier in the story. And the one that's probably the most chilling is the real mother of Maura Isles. See, Maura is and this is something that the other thing that's really weird about writing is I had put into maybe the third book that Maura was adopted. She's, and she loves her adoptive mother, but she doesn't know who her birth mother is. And I never imagined I would do anything with that. It was kind of like that, you leave the gun on the mantelpiece and you don't know you're going to use it later. That's what that was. So when I get to Body Double, I thought, oh, I had just read a story about serial killers running in family lines, and that became the reason why I wrote Body Double. I thought, well, we never really knew who Maura's mother was. What if Maura's mother was really creepy, and that's why she has been attracted to this very dark occupation? So, yeah, that was the killer in Body Double, who's been at it for many, many years. That was a big surprise for me, and also probably the creepiest thing when Maura finally goes to meet her mother for the first time in prison.
Out of curiosity, what do you most enjoy about the art of ratcheting up tension for the reader? For instance, you did it masterfully in Vanish when Jane is pregnant, ready to give labor at the hospital, and becomes part of a hostage party.
Well, I think Vanish is probably one of my best books. And poor Jane Rosoli, she had the longest pregnancy on earth. Her pregnancy lasted for 3 novels. So I knew she was going to give birth, and I just thought, what's the worst way to give birth? As a hostage with people trying to kill you. So I love this idea of a pregnant woman who's still courageous, who's still doing her job. Even in the midst of labor, she's still going to manage to try and defeat the bad guys. So that was where that idea came from. But the other thing that had happened was I had been reading about sex trafficking. So all those themes came in together with Vanish. And that is the story that I had a sex change for one of my characters. So the story started with one of the things that I was reading was from the newspapers at Boston, and it was about a young woman who was found dead in a bathtub, and they put her in a body bag and they shipped her off to the morgue, and she woke up. And that story just, it's one of those stories where writers will say, I can do something with that. I can make that into a book. So that's how Vanish starts off. It's a woman who wakes up in a body bag. She gets shipped off to the hospital right away. And then she does something that nobody expects. She grabs the security guard's gun and she kills him and she takes hostages. And that's where Jane Rosoli finds herself when she's gone to the hospital to have her baby, a hostage by this crazy woman who woke up in a body bag. So there were like multiple things that were feeding into this particular story. Jane's situation, the body bag lady, and the idea of sex trafficking being sort of the background flow of this story. I look back at it now and I don't know how I wrote that book. It just happened. Thinking about all these complicated things that don't seem to have any relationship with each other, and they turned into a story.
And that's the magic of writing, right? In a way.
Yeah, I think that I think one of my techniques is, first of all, I read a lot of true crime. I read a lot of just stories in the newspaper. And I find that most of my books probably draw from 2 or 3 disparate threads. I'll find something, in a newspaper today, and I'll find something from a magazine I cut off 20 years ago, and I'll use those 2 things, and they turn up in one book.
Then you treat readers to a murderous cabal in the Mephisto Club. What do you enjoy about shaking it up with the protagonists or group of antagonists that you write from book to book?
I'm very interested in biblical archaeology. So I was picking up some little texts I think it was in Oxford or something. I went to this old bookstore, and there was there were these sort of parts of the Bible that are actually not part of the Bible, and I was reading about these creatures called the Nephilim. They're fallen angels. So this is all ancient biblical texts, and the fallen angels are those who mated with human women and had this, they sort of fathered this new race of people that are living among us. They are truly evil, and it's all hocus pocus. But I thought, what if there was a grain of truth in that? What if they were actually describing a tribe of sociopaths who are among us? And wouldn't that be interesting if they had their own little sociopathic club and they went around killing each other? Well, if that were the case, wouldn't there be another club that would arise to oppose them? And that's where the Mephisto Club came in, as they were there to monitor crime around the world and to look for these sociopathic people. So it started off because of some weird interest I have in biblical archaeology.
I'm thinking of the archaeological backdrop in Keepsake as a wonderful example of your talent for creating fascinating settings to write against. What do you most enjoy about them? And that one particularly, what intrigued you?
Oh yeah. So I was an anthropology major in college. Um, you can do any major before going to medical school, but that was my thing. I really loved, especially I loved Egyptology. So I have been corresponding with this Egyptologist over the years, and he said, "Hey, we're about to do a CAT scan of a mummy. You want to come watch?" So I drove down to Poughkeepsie to watch this CAT scan of a mummy, and I was thinking as we're watching, these X-ray slices come through on the computer screen. What if they found something really weird that they were not expecting on this 2,000-year-old mummy? What if buried deep in this mummy they found a bullet? It's not a mummy, is it? It's not an ancient mummy. So that became it's kind of the leaping off place for the keepsake. And Maura Isles is watching a CT scan of an ancient mummy. They see a bullet. She sees the teeth have been removed, and she stops that right there, and she goes, "I'm calling homicide. This is a modern homicide." And it turns out that my idea was not all that far-fetched, because there have been cases of modern homicide victims that were mummified.
In Ice Cold, it was Dr. Maura Isles' turn to be in danger. What's important to you and do you think for your readers about keeping Rosoli and Isles out on a certain amount of an edge with new adventures when you go from book to book?
Well, again, I can talk about a newspaper article that started Vanish for me. I was reading about some odd little thing that it's called the Dugway sheep incident, and military people may have heard about this story. It's happened in the 70s, I think, somewhere in a place called Skull Valley, Utah, where farmers woke up one day. It was a cold evening, and all their sheep were dead. Thousands of sheep had died in this valley. And not only the sheep, there were birds that were dead lying on the ground. There were rabbits that were dead on the ground. So later it was declassified, and as you probably guessed, it was some kind of a military experiment gone awry. Nerve gas had gone the wrong way, gone into this valley and killed all these animals. And I remember thinking at the time, what if it had been summertime and people had left their windows open? You'd have a whole valley of dead people. What would you do to try and hide that? So that became one little element of the story. An isolated valley in the middle of nowhere where a town disappears. And the other part where I got more stranded in there was I had a GPS incident. I was, I know many of us have you followed your GPS into oblivion. Well, we followed our GPS right into a cornfield. And I think this happens all the time. So that those two things connected, where Maura finds herself stranded in the middle of winter in a little town where all the houses have been abandoned except the food is still on the table. What happened to this village of people? And it starts off because they were foolish enough to follow their GPS.
The Silent Girl was actually based on an ancient Chinese legend, correct? Tell us please how that one first sparked into a full-on idea for a book.
Well, the almost decapitated head was like a minor thing. That was a throw-on story. The real story was really an ancient Chinese legend called the Monkey King. And my mother used to tell me that story. And that probably Americans are familiar with it because there used to be a cartoon show called the Monkey King. Yeah, and also, when I was growing up, I watched a lot of kung fu movies that came out of Hong Kong. Yeah, the Bruce Lee stuff, but just a steady diet of it. So I was aware of all these legends, and my mother is from China, and I wanted to bring in some of my own ethnic background into the story. What is it like to be Chinese American? But the other thing that came into it was a real woman. This is based on a very famous martial artist named Bosim Mark. And she's about 5 feet tall and incredibly famous for being one of the people who brought Chinese martial arts to Boston. And I thought, oh, this is so cool. And, and now she's like in her 80s. But she could bring down the 200, 300-pound Navy SEALs practically. And everybody was always amazed that this little woman could bring down big men. So that was part of it also, was I wanted to bring in martial arts and the Monkey King, and what do I do with it? How do I get a story out of that? And the headless body on the roof was almost secondary to everything else.
By the time we reach the 10th book in the series, Last to Die, Rosoli and Isles are this time trying to save a school of orphans. What's it like writing from the victim's point of view?
I had wanted to use the idea of a school to train children to defend themselves. It's sort of a different kind of a school. A little bit like Harry Potter, except with not magic. Give them the tools to understand how to fight evil. So I needed some children. And I had three children who all had something in common. They were all survivors of horrible massacres of their families. And these children would be kind of orphans, and they would be brought to this one school. And that's how it all began, was this idea of a school in the woods. But what I loved was really getting into the heads of these three children. What is it like to lose your whole family? What is it like to suddenly realize somebody is still out to kill you, that somebody wants to wipe out everybody in your line, including you? And how do these three children bond and band together to protect themselves? So that was the whole idea. It was just a school in the woods.
Is it true that the premise for Die Again was actually art imitating life based on an experience you actually went through on safari?
I went on safari in South Africa, and there was one. My husband hates it when I tell this story. So if you go on safari, they always tell you to stay in the truck, right? You never get out of the truck, because once you get out of the truck, the animals just assume that you're available as prey, and then they'll kill you. But at the end of every day of sightseeing, we would be led to some beautiful place in the bush, and we'd get out of the truck and have cocktails. And that day we were all out of the truck, and our guide was there, and we were feeling pretty comfortable. And my husband says, "I really need to go pee. Can I go in those bushes there?" And our guide says, "Why don't you go in the bushes in the other direction?" Because I'd heard something on the radio about there was a leopard scene in that area. So my husband goes off in the other direction to use the bathroom, and out of the bushes that he had originally headed for, a leopard walked out. And we're all out of the truck. We're all standing around with our glasses of booze. And our guide kept us safe. He just moved between us and the leopard, and he made himself really big, and the leopard decided, no, not today, and walked away back in the bushes. So my husband could have died that day. But what impressed me was how this guide had kept us safe. I mean, he knew exactly what to do. So we're driving back. We're all kind of shaken. And I thought, oh, wow, this man kept us safe. But what if the man you trust in the bush is the one you should actually be terrified of? So that's how the idea of Die Again came from. It's a group of people who are off on safari in Botswana, in the wild, and they never come back. They just sort of die one by one in the bush. Who is the killer? And it ends up being a story that took place years before, and then Jane and Maura come into the story in Boston when the story ends up weaving into Boston.
Taking the most recent published book in the series, I Know a Secret, how much do you keep fan feedback in the background, or even expectations, when you're working on a new Rosoli and Isles book?
It's high pressure. It's terrible pressure. Sometimes I just want to write a book for myself. But I'm always aware that they're going to go, oh, I don't believe that. Although, honestly, after what's happened this week in the news, they should believe anything that happens. So I feel that I'm always under pressure to satisfy people. And that does, I think it probably slows my writing down quite a bit, where I'm always second guessing myself. But that particular story, I Know a Secret, was it was all villain based. That story was all about the villain.
Creepy.
And she's a fun villain, though, because she's a sociopath. And sociopaths are all around us. There's probably way more than we know who are around us, and they pass for normal. So I really wanted to get into the head of a sociopath, a very nice looking, really presentable sociopath. What is the world really like for them? And that was really what that story was about. It was about Holly and how she navigates in the world, and will she get one past Jane Rosoli?
How wild was it to see these characters come to life portrayed by Angie Harmon and Sasha Alexandra on the TV show?
Oh, it was so much fun. No, it was one of these things where it fell out of the sky. A producer called me up, said, "I love your girls. I think they belong on television." And then maybe a year and a half later, they had a script and they were filming, and it all came together really quickly. So I had nothing to do with it, except that I just got to sit back and enjoy the whole thing. They drew from John Doe, my short story, and they also drew heavily from The Apprentice for the pilot episode.
Yeah.
But there's, of course, it's television, so they made a couple of changes, and people will notice those changes because now Maura Isles is no more the chilly, cold, logical person. She's Sasha, who's fantastically beautiful and approachable. But that's the way they do. They change things in Hollywood. I know a lot of people say, "Aren't you bothered by the fact that characters have changed for television?" And as I like to say, look, I'm the birth mother. I birthed these girls, and then they walked off and they went to college, and they became individuals on television. So you're just watching the transition from my pen to, everywhere else. And I love the fact that they're popular around the world. I mean, I hear from Italian fans and fans all over the place who've watched the television show.
And then read the books. Before we turn to what you've been working on lately, tell us with Freaks and John Doe what it's like to do novellas versus the full-length novels.
I wrote those. I had to it's like pulling teeth. No, I write short stories when I'm asked to. I had been asked to write. The Freaks was actually asked by the Rosoli and Isles producers, who said we just want to put something on the website, on the TNT website. I said okay, and that was fun because it was about vampires. But a bit John Doe, that probably could have been expanded into a whole book, and I wish I could have used that as a whole book. But I find it really, really hard to write short stories, and I don't know if that's true for other novelists. I only write them when I'm trying to do a favor to somebody.
Thank you for your candor. It's what makes these conversations so revealing. So when you turn to standalones like Madam X, Playing with Fire, The Bone Garden, and The Shape of Night, what do you most enjoy about these? It must be a great escape to get away from a series to work on a standalone now and then.
If I couldn't write those, I would go insane. Because I can't stay with a series. I mean, Jane and Maura, I love you, but every so often I need a vacation from you. So actually, my favorite books are probably my standalones. Like The Bone Garden, for instance. I mean, that was a historical novel set in 1830. And it was about the history of medicine. It was about Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was a doctor. This is the Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., who was actually a doctor, not the jurist. And that gave me a chance to look back and what it was like to be a medical doctor in 1830, and what it was like to be, and horrifyingly enough, what it was like to be a patient in 1830. So that was a fun story for me, a very gruesome story, and I learned something about that. To do the research for that book, I was able to get my hands on an 1817 surgical textbook. And that was actually the surgical textbook that was used for consultation during the Civil War. And it was a step-by-step, kind of like how you look at your computer manuals to how to set up your computer. This was step-by-step how to cut off an arm, step-by-step how to cut off a leg. And it was horrifying. And so when I wrote that scene of an arm amputation, I was just doing what the surgeons did back then. So it was a look back at medicine and a reason to be grateful for the times we live in now when it comes to medical care. And then there was a story, Playing with Fire, which is one of my favorite books. It was more of a novella, I would call it. And that happened because I had been in Italy. I was in Venice and happened to see some Holocaust memorials and was wondering, what happened to some of the people that are listed on these plaques with their names? What became of them? So that story was about music and the Holocaust. And since I'm an amateur violinist, I was able to bring a lot of music into that story as well. What is it like to play the violin and compose?
Wonderful.
Yeah. And then finally, the one that was most recent, called The Shape of Night, was a complete departure. Very sexy. Kind of these, I guess the idea was, what if you could find the perfect lover? And what if the perfect lover was a ghost? And what if the ghost was making you do things that were more and more uncomfortable? And then what if you found out that every woman who lived in the same house had died in that house? Was it the ghost? So it started off as a sort of a romancy love story that quickly becomes dark and into a murder mystery.
You won the Best Romantic Suspense Novel Award from the Romance Writers of America and Best Mystery Novel from the Nero, and been nominated for Edgar's and Macavity's, among others. How important are awards to you in the grand scheme of things?
I don't get enough of them. it's I don't know. It's a lot of what I've done, a lot of my success, I have to put, and I know it sounds like I'm being, faux modest. A lot of it has to do with luck. It really does. It has to do with having the right book at the right time when everybody's ready for it. It has to do with having the right agent, the right publisher, the right marketing team. There's a writer behind all this, and there's a good book behind it. But there are lots of good books. There are lots of fantastic books that never find the success that mine did. So that's, in a way, I feel a little bit that way about awards. It's really nice. I feel fortunate, but I don't always feel I deserve them.
As we touched on at the top of the show, after 25 million books sold in 35 countries around the world, what gets you most excited to sit down and write for that global fan base every day?
It's the story. It's just wanting to tell the story and wanting to find out what happens to these characters. And also, I guess it's the challenge of telling a story in a fresh and new way, or telling a story that's never been told before. The book that's coming out soon is actually a collaboration between me and an author named Gary Braver. And it started off because I was watching the Me Too movement and thinking, oh my God, it's horrible what happened to these women. But every affair has two sides to the story. It's just like Rashomon, every incident has multiple points of view. And I was curious about what would a man think about the same affair that the woman would think. And that's where I had a chat with Gary Braver at a cocktail party, and I said, let's explore the Me Too movement, but from the male and the female point of view. So I wrote the points of view of the women in the story, and he wrote the point of view of the man in the story. And it was just fun to see how you can look at something in many ways.
For Rosoli and Isle fans, anything new on the horizon they can look forward to coming up?
Yeah, I'm on the third draft now. It continues to be as difficult as it ever was to write a story. So yeah, I'm working on number 13, and the fun part about this story is that I bring in Jane's mother. Now, Jane's mother has always been like a secondary character, but I've taken a lot more interest in middle-aged heroines. What is it like to be 55, 60, nobody really pays attention to you anymore, but you have eyes and you have a brain and you're seeing things that are, not kosher. How do you convince the world to listen to you? So that's what the new one, it's probably going to be called Mrs. Rosoli.
How much fun do you have corresponding with your readers from around the world talking about their favorite books?
I don't know if there is a typical Tess Gerritsen novel because I'm all over the place. I think that what happens is people appreciate certain books. They don't all appreciate all the books. There are readers who love Gravity and hate all the other stories. So, every book is going to find its own audience. And I appreciate the entire audience, but I also appreciate those people who find that the little orphan that didn't sell as well, but I loved, and they love it too. And they tell me. Or something like Playing with Fire, which, maybe a lot of readers are going, what are you doing writing about the Italian Holocaust? But then there's that one person who says, I'm a cellist, and I completely, this blew me away, about the idea of music and tragedy. So it's, every story is, I think, written for a different audience, and you just have to hope they find that story.
That's great advice. Before we close, any other gems you'd care to share with viewers here?
Oh, my first tidbit is don't be perfectionistic for the first draft. Just let the story tell itself and don't worry so much about whether it's perfect, because I have so many, I've had so many kids come up to me and say, well, I wrote 3 chapters and then I didn't know what to do. And then I wrote a different book and I've got 3 chapters of that. So they have all these partials that they've written, but they just can't get past that block because they don't know where the story's going. So I tell them, just keep writing and you'll see where the story is going. And the other thing is, I think it's constricting to write a detailed synopsis. I think that sometimes gets everybody stuck, because when they've written that synopsis, they already know what the story's about, and they get bored with the story. It's fun to have that exploration as you're going on about what's going to happen next. And the final thing is, I think that it really helps to be able to hear a character's voice speaking to you. That sometimes is what launches a book for me, is like Harvest. I began to hear that little boy's voice, the 12-year-old Yakov, and that began the story for me because I could hear that 12-year-old boy, and he was the emotional heart of the book.
Dr. Gerritsen, thank you so much again for taking out time to be on About the Authors TV. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you very much.